Hello, everybody. I'm Alex Halliday, Director of the Earth Institute. Welcome to a special summer edition of our Earth Lecture Series, a virtual discussion with our top researchers about matters of climate and survival. Today, we're going to be talking about the heat, how it's increasing, how the combination of heat and humidity in particular is creating potentially dire consequences for humanity, and what all of these developments mean to the future of life on Earth. I thought I'd start off with a little bit of a background on who we are. The Earth Institute's purpose is to bring together top Earth and environmental scientists with economists, lawyers, and public health and business policy experts and others to develop solutions to some of the most profound challenges facing humanity. The most striking of these is climate change. Of course, the pandemic has become extremely urgent and life-altering, and at the same time, that, of course, is something we also work in, things that have to do with sustainability of the planet more broadly. Our work on COVID-19 includes disaster management, climate and health, and we do quite a lot of work on infectious diseases more generally. To tackle climate change and its myriad consequences and public health challenges, Columbia announced last month that it is developing the Columbia Climate School. It's the first new school created at Columbia University in 25 years. And actually, forming a new school is a pretty unusual event. It's a big job. There's a ton of things to do, but it actually reflects the university's deepening commitment to see if there is some way in which we can have do more to actually help in terms of providing education, research, and informed opinion and help with communities, and learn from communities and learn from business leaders and discuss how we can actually transition the world to a more sustainable future. The central to this whole of this organization of the Climate School is going to be the Earth Institute, but it also involves all the other schools of the university who are deeply networked and engaged in the issue of climate change, and that is one of the reasons why we are developing the school in a particular way that actually brings the whole university to bear on this particular problem. Columbia's got enormous strength in this area. We added up the number of researchers and staff and faculty working on climate, and it comes, excluding students, it comes to close to 1,000 people. So this is a massive undertaking, and we're very excited about it. And we're looking forward to progressing with this very quickly because we want to get this thing going in a hurry to address the issues. So today we're going to be talking about heat. Some of you may have noticed the reports in the news. Death Valley recorded a scorching 130 degrees Fahrenheit or 54.4 degrees Celsius on Sunday. If the sensors and the other conditions check out, this would be the hottest Earth has been in more than 89 years. So there's more to be done to verify that, but that's actually an indication of where we are right now. Recent research tells us that this escalation of combined heat and humidity is becoming more prevalent and gripping parts of the world in ways that threaten survival, and it's getting worse. So we're going to basically be talking about that in the context of course, global warming, but also in terms of what the impacts will be on humans. And we brought together two guests tonight I'm in UK, who are going to be able to address this effectively. In particular, we have Emma Francis, who studies legal solutions to disaster displacement and climate migration. She also analyzes and supports the implementation of adaptive measures in small islands and least developed countries. Emma joined the Columbia Law School Sabin Center for Climate Change Law in September 2018 as the 2018 to 2020 Climate Law Fellow. Her work at the Sabin Center cuts across issues of international law. So thanks for joining us, Emma. Radley Horton is a climate scientist and research professor at the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory. Lamont is the largest center of the Earth Institute and a world-renowned earth and climate research enterprise. Much of Radley's research goes to the heart of how climate change is impacting society. He is also devoted to communicating about the urgency of this work to the larger media audience. Bradley, thanks for being here with us for this important discussion. So I'm going to invite each of you to provide some background on what you're working on. And I'm going to start with Amma. Amma, your video is off, but maybe some, oh, there you go. Great. Amma, do you want to introduce yourself for just a few minutes, just to quickly say about your background?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Alex, for convening this really important discussion, and to Radley for being in conversation with me. I think climate change is one of our most pressing challenges, and it's always exciting to be able to talk about it. People who care, so I'm looking forward to engaging. So I'm a lawyer at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, which is a think and do tank at Columbia Law School that develops legal solutions to tackling climate change. I, at the Sabin Center, focus mostly on climate-induced migration. The short story of that is that people are already moving because of climate-related impacts, and within the next 30 years, there will be millions of people moving. By 2050, about 200 million people will be moving because of climate-related events. And we are woefully unprepared to deal with this at an international level, at a domestic level, at a local level. And so my work focuses on identifying legal tools to bridge that gap, and prepare federal, state, and local government and other key decision makers to manage the risks that are associated with migration. That can look like a number of things. I've researched legal incentives for moving people inland away from coastal areas that are heavily impacted by sea level rise. I've advocated for US cities who are suing fossil fuel companies in order to increase the number of resources cities have for adapting to climate change impacts. I've also written on the legal protection gap surrounding climate-induced migration, and in particular people who are moving across national borders. And I'm looking forward to talking about all of this more. But in sum, I focus on the human face of the climate challenge, which is climate migration. And I use legal tools to make sure that we're leaving no one behind.
Amma, that's great. Thank you. Radley, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Alex. It's great to speak with you all today. So I study climate extremes as a climate scientist. And what I mean by that is that I focus both on the sort of relatively short duration, often local events that are so impactful, things like heat waves, intense precipitation events, coastal flooding associated with our storms and sea level rise. But when I talk about extremes, I also mean what we might think of as tail risks more generally. So these are the types of events that we like to think of as low probability, but very high consequence should they happen. And unfortunately, we're learning that some of these types of events may not be quite as low probability as we had thought. So this last category isn't just the short duration weather events, but it's also questions like just how much could sea level rise under worst case scenarios? Just when might we potentially see sea ice disappearing in the Arctic Ocean? Now, my research also focuses on climate impacts. So within my research group, we're asking questions that maybe haven't been considered so much so far within the impact space, or where the tail risks may be underestimated again. So an example of the former, a type of climate impact that maybe hasn't been thought about that much, we've been looking at how higher temperatures may make it tougher for airplanes to be able to get the lift that they need to take off at full capacity on short runways. We've been looking at how outbreaks of cold air may impact ecological pests, leading to cascading impacts on forests, for example. And we've been looking at how heavy precipitation may impact crop yields. And then in terms of those tail risk impact events, we're looking at things like connections within extreme events. So what if you get a heat wave after a hurricane? Does that produce some nonlinear impacts on our vulnerable communities, on our critical infrastructure, if we think about pairing between different types of extremes? The final thing that I spend time thinking about is adaptation, preparing for these emerging climate risks. And I look at both urban megalopolis contexts, but also small communities around the world. And one of the things we'll be talking about today is what sea level rise and coastal flooding mean for the big cities, the small communities too. And there's a New York Times article that will unpack a little bit on this topic of who's vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal flooding that we'll bring up now. And this connects with some of the other themes that we'll get into today. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much. Both of you have chosen to study issues that impact society with amazing immediacy and urgency. What led you to actually pursue these areas? How did you get interested in these subjects in the first place? Maybe I'll quickly ask Amma and Radley to give us a short answer each on these, but Amma, what about you?
Sure. So I'm originally from a small island state in the Caribbean called Dominica, which I actually love really deeply. It's a place that's filled with mountains, rivers, and people who are incredibly strong and warm-hearted. And climate change is one of our biggest threats. We are facing increasingly severe and frequent hurricanes that can roll back decades of development and spur really significant population loss. So I'll give an example. After Hurricane Maria, which is a Category 5 that hit the island in 2017, the island was completely devastated. 90% of buildings were damaged or destroyed. And when you have something like 90% of buildings, that means that people have no place to go. So we lost 20% of our population permanently. I'm motivated to work on climate migration, not just because it's personal to me. My own family, for example, relocated after Hurricane Maria, but also because I think it's a challenge that we can actually solve. So my work focuses on two gaps. The first is the gap surrounding climate migrants who are moving across national borders. The majority of climate migrants move within their own countries, but some are forced to cross international borders. And when they do so, the law guarantees almost zero protection. There's no multilateral framework or UN agreement that covers climate migration, and there's no legal rights afforded in law such that when climate migrants move across borders, they're protected from forcible return or even allowed to resettle in a place that would be safe for them. So this is one of the gaps that my work seeks to fill. The second gap is around domestic level planning. I mentioned that the majority of climate migrants move within their own countries. Well, most national governments, state governments, local governments aren't actually prepared to deal with this movement of people. In the US, for example, we just saw a report come out this summer that stated that millions of Americans live in coastal areas that are threatened by sea level rise. And in all but the most optimistic scenario, many coastal residents will have to face the specter of relocating entirely because of the threats of climate change. This is to say this is an unavoidable thing. Climate migration is unavoidable, but it's not unsolvable. We can actually plan for it. And so my work focuses on preparing key federal, state, local government actors to actually mitigate the risks associated with climate migration.
Wow, that's fantastic. Radley, tell us about you. How did you get interested in these topics?
Sure. So I think, you know, a critical thing for me was that I had the opportunity to travel a lot before picking my career. I don't know why I was motivated to travel. It may have been because my mom was the daughter of a diplomat and had lived in developing countries growing up. But for whatever reason, I got at a pretty early age the chance to travel quite a bit and see how intense some of the vulnerabilities that certain communities experience are, how little power they sometimes have over various aspects of their futures. And the almost universal takeaway, which won't be a surprise to anybody, but was to me as a kid, is that it's through no fault of their own. Often the groups that have the strongest impact on society are the least vulnerable. So when I eventually moved to climate science, I think those experiences helped me to be a little more empathetic and to focus on climate research that's really geared towards the impacts on people of climate. And this is an approach to risk assessment that's sometimes referred to as like the bottom-up approach instead of top-down. Instead of a scientist like myself just showing up at a meeting with decision makers or communities with a map that says something like, here's the amount of global warming that the US is going to experience this year. Instead, maybe you start out sitting down with a community, a group of decision makers, asking them how they've been affected by weather events in the past, what their sort of fears are more generally. And then from there, maybe you get to the point where that first climate map you produce is something that talks about heat waves, if that's a particular concern for a community. whether they're going to get longer in the future, for example. So that's kind of the bottom-up approach. It applies to the climate science, but also when we start thinking about adaptation, resilience, retreat, you start with the community to get a sense of what their needs are, before you bring that kind of top-down science. And then just quickly, I think another key piece for me was that I was actually a liberal arts major in college. And I think that helped me a little bit to appreciate the need for like working across disciplines, as we're discussing in the climate school. Physical sciences like climate science are so critical, but they're very far from being the only component that we need, as you noted, Alex, to address these climate issues. Indeed, some of the most basic aspects of climate change have been understood for a very long time. The climate is changing. It's mostly due to our activities. The impacts are very serious, but there's still time to act. So one of the critical questions is, how do we inspire people to act? How do we work across societies? How do we leverage for change? And climate science is one piece of that, but arguably a relatively small piece.
Yep, I agree to that. So Amma, let's talk about climate migration. You used the term migration right from the beginning, and it's clearly a key thing that you're working on. What are the most pressing challenges around climate migration, this whole area?
Yeah, sure. And I'll just take a step back to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what climate migration is. So climate migration can describe movement that's either forced or voluntary that results from climate-related events like sea level rise or a hurricane or drought. I like to explain this through disaster. So the basic mechanism is that climate change increases the frequency and intensity of disaster, and then disasters displace millions annually. This is something I like to highlight, is this is already a problem. Disasters have been the lead cause of displacement for the last 2 years worldwide, more than armed conflict or violence. And it's going to be an increasing problem. By some estimates, 1 in every 45 people worldwide will be displaced by climate change within the next 30 years. So the scale of the problem is one of the pressing challenges. Just another small note to nuance our discussion. Climate migration can be both temporary or permanent. The majority happens internally, so people move mostly within national borders, but as I mentioned, some climate migrants are forced to move abroad. But to get back to your real question about the most pressing challenges, I think the most pressing challenge around this issue is the lack of governance at multiple levels. So at the international level, for climate migrants who are moving across national borders, I mentioned that there's no multilateral agreement that governs climate migration. That means governments around the world have not agreed on how to solve this problem. Not only that, climate migrants aren't covered by international refugee law. So while people fleeing political persecution, for example, have the theoretical right to access asylum in other countries, for climate migrants, they find themselves with no right to enter another country, resettle there, or be protected from being deported to their home countries if they're fleeing a climate-related event. This is a huge legal protection gap, and I think this is one of the most pressing challenges that we're seeing. At the national level, national governments are still at the early stages of testing out legal structures that can help. Legal structures, for example, like temporary work schemes that allow migrants from certain areas to migrate to other countries and fill labor gaps. These are at the early stages, so this is another challenge, sort of testing these solutions as they come up. And then at the local level, cities are at the forefront of climate migration. They're often the ones receiving migrants, but cities are still developing the capacity to make sure that they can feed, feed, house, shelter, and employ increasing numbers of people. And so legal protection and also governance at both the international, national, local, at all levels, really, from the top all the way down, is absolutely critical in managing this challenge.
Yeah. Bradley, in May, you and your colleague, Colin Raymond, published a new study building on your previous work around the rising threat of hot and humid conditions. So moving on from, we'll get back to migration in a minute, but in terms of the root causes, what might cause migration, can you tell us a bit about the substance of your report and why is this combination of heat and humidity so very dangerous?
Yeah, sure. So, the bottom line is that it really is the case that it's not just the heat, it's the humidity. And most fundamentally, humans and really all large mammals are prone to overheating. And the key mechanism, the key way to cool is through sweating, through evaporation. And if the temperatures are really high, there's the potential for there to be so much moisture in the air that basically you don't have the gradient that you need to be able to release moisture from your body to the atmosphere. And that's really a fundamental constraint potentially on habitability for people. So in our study, we sort of focused on a couple thresholds. First, we looked at suggested absolute value of temperature and humidity, known as a wet bulb temperature, above a certain threshold. And the thinking is that if there's so much moisture in the air that you cross that threshold, it basically doesn't matter how good a health condition you're in, whether you're sitting in the shade, not exercising, with an endless supply of water, perfect clothing or no clothing. It's thermodynamically impossible to stay cool enough over time. So we looked at that threshold, but we also realized that in practice, at much lower combinations of heat and humidity, people really start to suffer. So if you think about that sort of worst day per year of heat and humidity in much of the eastern United States, that's what we call a wet bulb temperature of like 26. That's enough that we're concerned about elderly populations, we're concerned about kids doing sports outdoors, we're concerned about construction workers. So really these thresholds are with us every day. It's not just this one proposed threshold. The quick takeaways from our study specifically were that extreme measure where nobody can survive outdoors is already happening. Earlier studies had said it was an issue maybe for later this century if we don't reduce emissions. We showed that parts of the Persian Gulf, even Pakistan, are right around that threshold now. And maybe more importantly, we showed that across the entire globe, at those lower thresholds of temperature and humidity, such as that sort of worst day per year in the eastern United States, those events are now happening twice as often as they were just 40 years ago, when a lot of our critical infrastructure, our air conditioning systems were developed, for example. So it's already an emerging risk.
So, Amma, when Radley talks about these kinds of things and the increasingly difficult conditions under which people are living, and the areas of the world most likely impacted by these severe conditions, what are your thoughts on how this could force migration?
Yeah, so thanks, Radley, for sharing a little bit more about your work and listening. It's a little terrifying. If others feel that way, empathize. But I think one of the really important things, the messages that I got from your work, Radley, is that inhabitability, is a spectrum. So an area being uninhabitable it happens on a spectrum. So for some populations, they might be in places where they can live for part of the year, but not all of the year. Other populations might be in areas that are rendered completely uninhabitable by climate change. And so that invites us to ask different questions. For people who are living in areas that are uninhabitable for only part of the year, the question is, where will these people temporarily go? A lot of climate migration tends to be temporary, so people move for a short period of time, but then try to move back. And I think one of the exciting developments in this area is that a number of governments are starting to use what are called temporary work schemes to allow people to migrate temporarily, work, fill critical labor gaps, and then return home. And for places that are uninhabitable for just parts of the year, this might be an appropriate solution. But there are also places that climate change will render completely uninhabitable, like small island states in the Pacific, for example. And then the challenges become a little different because people don't have the opportunity to return home, but don't have a place where they can access water or food or opportunities for making a living. And so then the question becomes, how do you plan for this? How do you govern that population of people? How do you provide critical services? So yeah, it's a huge challenge. But again, I always like to highlight that this is a challenge that we actually can fix. So even just for people who are coming from uninhabitable small island states, we could create a special visa category in places that aren't going to be uninhabitable. So there are ways to fix the problem, and heat's not the only trigger. Coastal impacts, sea level rise are also reasons that people might have to move.
So Radley, to get back to the science of this a little bit, we've had these reports that and statistics that indicate the hottest years on record have occurred in the past 5. Should we be necessarily connecting these trends to global warming? Could these trends, like last year's Paris heat wave and last month's Middle Eastern severe heat, all be part of so-called natural occurrences, or is that complete nonsense?
Yeah, so it really depends on the spatial scale and the time scale. If we're talking about an individual heat wave in one location, whether it's what's happening in the Western US today, Europe recently, Middle East, if it's one event, there's going to be a huge amount of just sort of natural variability, weather, if you will. But when we start, as you mentioned at the beginning of the question, averaging across the entire globe, averaging across an entire year, there the sort of random variability is much smaller. Because of counteracting effects. And we can actually see the signal, even in just a few years of data, the influence of human activities is very much there. So, and in fact, if we look in global temperature records that go back to about 1880 or so, if we look at the warmest years that have happened, 19 of the 20 warmest years that have been experienced since 1880 have happened just in the 20 or so years of this century. So that shows you how the statistics have already shifted due to the influence of human activities. And it's not just temperature, right? We're also seeing the sea level rise as the oceans expand, the land ice melts, warming of the upper atmosphere, and more water vapor. It's a variety of factors. So you're always going to have those individual local heat waves, for example. Climate change gives them a nudge, though, making them more common, more extreme when they happen, is really the answer.
Okay, so that's very helpful. Can we tie this to CO2? I mean, is there a really, are there particular actions we should be taking around this? And maybe I can talk to Amma, I get Amma to respond to this on what governments and policymakers can do.
Yeah, actually, I would love to hear what Radley has to say first, then I'm happy to jump in after. It seems like a natural follow-up.
Sure. Okay, thanks. I think, the starting point here, I would say, is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a lot of ways we can do that. I think in some ways, the sort of first order steps are becoming clearer and clearer. If, as a society, globally, we stopped subsidizing fossil fuels, that would be critical step that would get us a lot of the way there. Prices for renewables and even for battery storage increasingly are approaching or passing parity when compared to the cost of fossil fuels, even if you don't consider the environmental effects, just the sort of raw cost. So in an aggregate sense, I think we're close to the point where the private sector can do much of the rest, as long as there's a signal that there won't be propping up and support for fossil fuels. It's a similar story for energy efficiency. So I think, we can get close to the way there just by getting out of the way, but we can't get all the way there without more active intervention, because we need to ask, if we see the sort of private sector-led efforts, are vulnerable communities going to be left behind? Are we going to see just outcomes for vulnerable communities? And could some countries be left behind too? And similarly, to really avoid the worst consequences of climate change, we have to cut our emissions so dramatically, that we need to push hard on some things that still look challenging, like the sources of energy for industrial activities, forging of metal. That we still need to rely on fossil fuels for to get to those high temperatures. Similarly, when we think about aviation and all the transport that happens, all the shipping on the oceans, we don't have good substitute fuels yet. So we need some investment in those areas too.
Amma, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think cutting emissions is absolutely the right answer in the realm of climate migration. The World Bank has reported that if we drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we'll reduce the number of climate migrants by 80%. And so I think that the answer is almost always cut carbon pollution. But I think what I've been learning from our current public health crisis is that either intentionally or unintentionally, governments and policymakers can leave populations behind, treat certain segments of our population as expendable. And I think that any climate action needs to make sure that we're being protective of the most vulnerable segments of our society, as Radley brought up. Another critical thing is that foresight is so important. The New York Times article that we brought up earlier recently reported that the US can expect 30 million migrants from Central America and Mexico within the next 30 years. So just from that one region, Central America and Mexico, the US can expect 30 million people by 2050. Unplanned, this will be an absolute disaster. So I really want to see governments taking proactive measures to manage migration flows. And there are a number of ways to do this. One legal framework that I work on are trade agreements that allow people to move more easily from a set of participating countries. And these trade agreements are so critical because they allow people to not only access labor markets, but also simply have the right to enter other countries and seek shelter and safety. More than 60% of nations in the world participate in trade agreements like this that have provisions that liberalize movement. And I would love to see governments participating in more and very simply increasing the numbers of ways that people have to legally move to other places. Yeah, I think that would make a huge difference in terms of climate migration.
Right, right. So I realize that the light is fading here in the UK and I'm starting to look like a Caravaggio painting. I'm sorry about that, but it's part of the, I'm not staying in my own place right now. So let's move on to flooding, because I think this is going to be a major issue going forward as well. So, and how it impacts migration. A new study published in July found that by the end of the century, nearly 290 million people, equal to the population of Canada, Mexico, and all of Central America combined, could be affected by repeat flooding. So and the related economic damage could be vast, equivalent to 20% of global GDP. So Amma, do you want to say anything about, through the prism of your work in particular, and the work of the Sabin Center, how serious the situation really is?
Yeah, sure. I think I hear these figures, 290 million, 143 million, 200 million. I think that it's just so clear that this is a staggering issue. And I think that sometimes paralyzes us. But again, this is a manageable problem. So for flooding in particular, single floods usually lead to short-term displacement, so households can return. But when you have chronic flooding, permanent flooding, that often leads to permanent displacement over time because the capacity of a household to respond is undermined. The simple way to say this is that repeat flooding calls for managed retreat to mitigate risks, including economic risks. So in many places, economic resources are concentrated in coastal areas, and this exacerbates the effects of flooding. I'll give a local example for those of us who are in New York. In Southampton, for example, property valued at $1.4 billion is at risk of becoming chronically inundated within the next 10 years. And so finding ways to incentivize movement away from areas that are prone to repeat flooding is really helpful for managing the negative consequences like loss of life, loss of property. And on the other end, keeping with our theme of making sure that our solutions are also responsive to the most vulnerable segments of populations, when we incentivize movement away from one area to another area, we also need to make sure that people who are already living there aren't further displaced.
Yeah, absolutely. So Radley, we should move along fairly quickly because I want to bring the audience in fairly soon to ask questions, who want to ask questions. That same study indicates that flooding is likely to happen whether or not the world takes action to sharply cut emissions. And so that was quite surprising. It says that the study says that the usage of fossil fuels increasing carbon emissions, they will continue to rise. If you compare that with a scenario where emissions peak around 2040 and then start to fall, you get similar amounts of flooding regardless. Does this surprise you? And what does this tell us about our future? What are we missing here?
Yeah, so this is one of the unfortunate challenges. We were talking earlier about how do we inspire action? I mean, unfortunately, we know that what motivates people tends to be what's directly in front of them. But when we think about climate change, these greenhouse gases are well mixed. They affect the whole planet. And carbon dioxide on average lasts in the atmosphere for over 100 years. So that does pose a real challenge here because we are locked in already to some additional warming. And when we think about our ice sheets too, they have not changed and become undermined yet in all the ways that they will be, even by the warming today. It takes time to sort of erode those ice sheets in ways that move them to the ocean and raise sea level. So that's the negative side of the story, of course. It's not enough to tell people we can avoid the worst outcomes by reducing emissions now far in the century. We have to also say, what are the benefits today? And fortunately, there are a lot of benefits today. The quicker we reduce our emissions, pretty quickly we can get air quality gains, whether it's fewer small particles affecting people's breathing, for example. This is associated with less incomplete combustion in wood stoves and engines. There's also a climate effect to that very quickly, those small particles. And then we can also think, of course, about the economic gains associated with reducing emissions and eventually getting people to experience less risks. Emerging job opportunities in renewable energy, electrical transmission, battery storage, investment opportunities in this new space, environmental justice outcomes, since we remember that it's the most vulnerable communities that tend to be exposed to the poor air quality and to often not get these opportunities. So we can really redress some of these environmental justice legacy issues, geopolitical gains associated with going towards renewables and getting off of fossil fuels. These are all things that give relatively quick advantages and are really net positives, not just in the long term, but in the short term too.
Okay, I'm going to move on quickly because I think I want to get on to the issue of managed retreat quickly, and then we should have some questions, if that's okay. But could you just quickly explain the concept of managed retreat? The Earth Institute ran this conference. Radley, you were one of the organizers last year on managed retreat. It was a kind of a new term and it invoked lots of interest from many people. Amma, would you explain roughly what are the ways in which managed retreat might, how heat scenarios might trigger the need for managed retreat and how we plan for those things and what it means, basically?
Right, sure. So managed retreat very simply is the purposeful coordinated movement of people and assets out of harm's way, harm caused by climate-related impacts. That could be heat, but it could also be other triggers like coastal hazards. And unfortunately, we're seeing that although this is a really difficult decision, it's becoming necessary in many places. I think there are just two things to highlight quickly about managed retreat and the term. One is that the term retreat can really emphasize the aspect of community organizing. So these processes, when done well, are really community-led. And the second is that the second aspect of managed retreat that it's important to highlight is that managed retreat is yet another form of adaptation. It's another form of climate resilience.
Okay, Bradley?
Sure, yeah. People sometimes talk about categories of adaptation. The first thing you hear about, for example, whether it's a coastal threat or heat, is avoidance. So this might be something like putting up a seawall around a city. Then there's the notion of accommodation. Maybe a building can have its critical equipment, its generators, placed on a higher floor. Maybe that ground floor can be a parking garage some of the time, but when a surge is expected, you just can accommodate that water somehow. And then this other category we're talking about is this more extreme, in a sense, example of retreat. Retreat is very challenging in many ways, but the bottom line is that whether it's from the perspective of trying to protect lives in some of these areas, or trying to avoid these repeat economic costs associated with repetitive flooding, for example, it seems inevitable that retreat is going to become more and more part of this dialogue to save lives, and because the economic alternative is really too costly. In the heat context, air conditioning becomes a life or death issue in these humid heat environments. Some people are always going to need to work outdoors. Think of all the farmers in India, Pakistan experiencing these extreme conditions. So it's inevitable, I think, that we will hear more about retreat, because it's connected to this notion about the viability of the land, increasing risk of conflict, economic collapse. These are all these sort of complicated factors that can conspire. And when we think about, it might not be crossing the actual extreme threshold of heat and humidity that triggers wide-scale movement. It might not actually be the arrival of these high sea levels that triggers people moving. It could happen a lot sooner. And so how do we prepare? And I think when we think about compound risks, the communities that have suffered so badly from COVID being those same communities that are often vulnerable to the highest temperatures. You put it all together, and well before you get to that climate threshold, you can see these communities really being pushed over the edge. So if we prepare, we can best deal with these changes before they become a sort of disorderly unwinding that threatens our most vulnerable especially.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're going to move over into some questions now. So there's been a lot of questions coming in and they're being fed to us. We're not going to get through all the questions, I might as well tell you, but here are some, to kick things off, if we can give brief answers, because there's already a lot of questions. First off, is there anything about the impact of climate change and higher temperatures on human diseases? And I'm wondering if you've got any insights into that. Maybe Radley, you know something about this?
Sure. Yeah. There's a lot to get into there with vector-borne diseases, mosquitoes. Some of the things that we're going to be thinking about are you not crossing these cold temperature thresholds that you used to cross that would kill off some of these species? And then additionally, if your overall temperatures in the warm season are higher, is that allowing you to have more reproductive cycles for some of those insects? Those combinations are the kind of things that can give you far more of a vector. We have to also think about waterborne diseases. What are higher temperatures going to mean for things like risk of cholera, for example? It gets complicated in a hurry. There's even issues related to food spoilage that you might want to think about with higher temperatures. But those are a few of the examples of how climate can impact vector-borne diseases. And in addition to the ways that higher temperatures directly affect human health, our ability to breathe for the vulnerable, those with cardiovascular disease, renal issues, for example, all suffer directly from heat.
So Amma, maybe you can answer this one. We're thinking about maybe having a new United States president, or maybe continuing with the one we've got. And they typically are thinking about a 4-year window in which they're going to operate and try and achieve something. So given that they're thinking about what they can do in 4 years or not do in 4 years or undo in 4 years, give us your perspective on how we actually move forward with something that actually has such a long time horizon to it, like climate change.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think one of the challenges with climate change is that we're not necessarily, our political systems aren't structured to deal with long-term problems so much as short-term incentives. But for climate change, I think for the US government, we've seen a lot of useful and hopeful developments in terms of climate planning. So the US House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, for example, recently released a climate action plan that talks about how to equitably transition the US economy to renewable energies, how to protect environmental justice communities from pollution, and a number of other really helpful measures that make it clear that no matter what side of the political aisle you sit on, climate change will affect you, and that it's to all our benefit to plan for it. I think the only other thing that I would mention is that we've seen under the Trump administration that there's been a lot of deregulatory activity, or for those of us who aren't following regulatory regime, that just means that Trump has done a lot to undermine US agencies' efforts to plan for climate change. And under a new administration, we could see some of these regulations, these attempts at climate planning for climate resilience come back as a possibility. And because of this system of checks and balances within the US, it wouldn't actually be that easy to undermine these efforts, these regulatory efforts, and because of legal processes that require public participation, for example. So I think it's not as simple as you know, we have one president now, another president then, and we in the US luckily have a system where we can create long-term change, at least through a regulatory regime, and hopefully we have a president who takes that view next term. Okay,
that's great. Somebody's asked about how climate change will affect renewable energy sources like solar, wind, and hydro. I mean, I would guess it will increase the demand, but Radley, do you want to quickly answer that?
Yeah, so, you know, I guess thinking about it a little bit more on the supply side, this is an interesting question. I'd say that there hasn't been enough research on this topic. How might climate change impact the supply, the availability of renewables? This is one of those sort of frontier issues that we need to study more. But I think there's some things we know. I think based on what we know today, there isn't a huge concern about less solar being available in the future. I think in general, there's not much concern about less wind either. There could be some shifting in the locations, but I think it's based on our knowledge today, those aren't first order issues. The hydro one, I think is a little more interesting. In the short term, as we think about some of these high glaciers, some of these snowpacks that are going to be increasingly compromised by higher temperatures, you could actually see a situation, and are seeing a situation, where in the current situation in the next decade, you might actually see more faster and more unpredictable runoff as some of those snow and glaciers melt, giving you more hydro availability. But that's short term. Actually, a pretty existential threat is going to emerge in some of these areas once you lose that ice water reservoir in the future. So I think that's a concern for hydropower, although as we get several decades out, although I think more research is needed, and it's going to be very region specific.
Yeah. Actually, an interesting question here is about the pandemic and how much that might be affecting people's ability to migrate. Of course, there's also other interesting relationships about the pandemic and what you do during hurricane season and what you do during, and how the global slowdown affects climate warming. All of these things are interconnected. But I was wondering if, Amar, if you could in particular give us some clues about how the pandemic might affect people's ability to migrate, and given that we may actually see a spread in infectious diseases in the future and changes in infectious diseases in the future, I guess this is going to be an issue in the future with climate change as well.
Absolutely. And, you know, this is really, I think we're all living through COVID-19 and learning as we go along. But one thing that we're seeing is that some populations are getting trapped. So you might have started your migration journey, but borders are closed or flights are hard to access. And so some migrants have become trapped in fairly vulnerable situations because of COVID-19. And you're absolutely right, Alex, to point out the health impacts of climate change and the likelihood that we will be facing increasing health impacts, pandemics, and the spread of infectious diseases. And I'd just like to highlight one intersection that doesn't often get talked about, which is that it's really hard to transfer medical records across borders. So when people migrate, they might not migrate with access to their medical history. This makes it really hard for people who are sick, especially, to seek care when they're migrating. And so this is another challenge that I think COVID-19 underlines.
Yeah, absolutely. Is climate change, another question, is climate change making hurricanes more intense but not more frequent? Bradley, I guess this is a question for you. Or does climate change cause both more frequent and more intense storms?
Sure. Yeah, so I'd say, there's pretty strong evidence at this point that the most powerful hurricanes, these Category 3, Category 4, Category 5, will become more frequent with climate change. I think it's not a sure thing, when we're thinking about what to expect with climate change. This is one we can't say we're 100% sure of, but the balance of evidence, we think about the fact that we know the oceans are going to warm, is that the biggest hurricanes probably become even stronger, more powerful. When we ask how the total number of hurricanes is going to change, this is something that is really a very open research question. Majority of studies might suggest slight decrease or staying the same, but there have been a few recent studies saying maybe the total number also could increase. Bottom line is we don't really know, I'd say, how the total number will increase, but it's the big ones that have by far the strongest impacts, whether it's human lives or economic costs. And the big thing to keep in mind, sea levels are rising. This is a sure thing. That means that even if we somehow had weaker hurricanes in the future, we'd actually see much more dangerous flooding just because we're raising that baseline so much.
That's really helpful. So, well, not very helpful, but good answer. Thank you. Amma, climate migration, is this being tracked globally? I've got a question here. Is there a website or a group of researchers who are tracking where displacement is occurring, why that's happening and where they are going?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question, and I'd point this person and anyone who's interested in learning more to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center's website. They keep up to date and track displacement as a result of disasters, some climate related, that happens within national borders, so internal displacement. They don't track displacement when it occurs across borders. This has been a much bigger challenge for those of us studying migration. So I can't point you to specific sources for cross-border migration, but IDMC is a great place to start in terms of internal displacement.
Okay. So the great thing about, we used to do these sort of events in Manhattan with about 50 people and a sort of gathered group of people. In this case, we've got hundreds of people, thousands maybe, listening in, and so and they're from all over the world, which is really brilliant. So Carlos from Ecuador, hi Carlos, asked how we can create research and education programs to help regions like Latin America and what the main climate challenges are. Climate challenges are in Latin America specifically. You can each have a go at this. Radley, do you want to kick off and see what you think?
Sure. Yeah. If it's also okay, I think Alex, your perspective, maybe especially on the research and education dimension, would be really interesting. In terms of the physical hazards, I mentioned the glaciers before, mountain glaciers, a critical issue across much of Latin America. You're seeing more flooding with more rapid melt now, but eventually there's very serious concern about what happens when those sources of water are no longer available. Other hazards to think about, certainly there's concern about what's happening in the Amazon. Some of that's directly due to humans cutting down trees for sure, but could there potentially be some feedbacks there where the climate could get nudged to such a large extent, either by deforestation or by just larger scale changes in the climate we're seeing, that parts of the Amazon shift and are no longer conducive to rainforest. That's the kind of thing that wouldn't just have huge local impacts, but that could itself essentially lead to the whole climate system, the bell, if you will, of these sort of forcings changing in ways that could have downstream effects over the entire planet, including but not limited to changes in exactly how much carbon is in the atmosphere, right? If we start to burn those forests in increasing mass. Heat and humidity is another big concern. Drought, it's a long list. Yeah, I'd love to hear from you and Amma on some of the other dimensions, including the how to build the research and education programs and maybe other policy questions.
Amma, why don't you respond first? Sure. I just want to actually lift up Latin America as a leader in terms of responding to climate migration. There are a number of mechanisms in place in the region that facilitate movement of people. I mentioned earlier that climate migrants aren't covered by international refugee law. Well, in Latin America, under the Cartagena Declaration of 1984, actually, the definition of refugees is such that climate migrants technically could be included in that framework. And people moving because of environmental disasters in the past have sought protection in other countries underneath that framework. So I just want to highlight that when we talk about regions, we don't just need to talk about the challenges, but also the ways that certain regions are actually pushing the needle forward on how to respond to climate challenges. Okay, so I think that's really helpful. I think one more thing I'd just say about that, and that is that I think the climate school that we're developing at Columbia, we're developing education programs, and we're hoping to, and research programs that we want to make global. And I think there's no question we see this as a global challenge with local adaptation strategies being needed. And so we're keen to partner with other organizations, keen to see other people do the same thing as we're doing. And so if there are ways in which we can help with education and research programs, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. I just wanted to quickly move to, we're running out of time, so and I want to, in a few minutes, I'm just going to ask you, in 2 minutes, I'm going to ask each of you for a quick one-liner on your main take-home message for the people who are listening. So I'll ask both of you that question at the end. But there's one more, couple of questions here that I want to quickly get your, sound bites on. What policies should we support or would make the most sense in regard to immigration or displacement between coastal and inland states and regions? So this could be within the same country, but actually moving away from Miami or wherever it is. What are your thoughts on that, Radley?
Can I cede my time to Amma just because we're coming on the end? Is that all right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say if in terms of immigration policy, it's much easier when people are moving within country because there aren't the same requirements necessarily or barriers to immigration. But I think something that's really important is making sure that receiving states and cities are actually equipped to receive the number of residents that might be moving.
Okay, so that's great. One more quick question. For you, Amma. In your view, is instilling legal protections for climate refugees worth pursuing, or is advocating for an international treaty too little too late now?
I always hate this question. This is such a tough one. But my answer to this is honestly, I think that our energy is better spent in bilateral and regional agreements at this point because of both the nature of climate migration and also just because that seems more politically feasible. And I'm a pragmatist when it comes to this. I want to see people protected.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Well, it's been a wonderful Q&A session. Quick take-home messages from both of you. Radley, why don't you go first?
Small amounts of warming mean a lot. 1.5 degrees of warming doesn't sound like much, but it's already got us near the edge of critical tipping points. Coral reefs, far more heat waves already. This is very scary, but tipping points can also work in our favor. I think we've underestimated how people can unite to quickly address these issues, whether it's investors beginning to demand that companies remove their commitment to fossil fuels and think about these climate risks, whether it's young people picking jobs, picking universities, investing in ways that reward. I think we can see change very quickly towards a more just world and one with much less fossil fuels. So small changes can matter a lot through their tipping point effects.
Okay, that's great. Amma, what's your takeaway message?
Yeah, another hopeful message. There's no avoiding climate migration at this point. People are already moving and will continue to move, and we can either avoid this and worsen the consequences, or we can plan at the international, federal, and local levels and make sure that we're really positioned to secure the benefits of migration.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank everybody for listening in. I hope you found it useful. And we look forward to having more of these series discussions with you, and you can get to hear some more experts going forward as we start up our fall program. Keep a watch out for exciting news about the climate school going forward. And I'd just like to finish by thanking very, very much Radley Horton and Emma Francis for one of the amazing discussion and sets of points of view we've been able to hear today. It's been great. So thank you very much. Keep safe and keep well wherever you are. And good night from the Earth Institute.